What gauge do we pierce oral piercings at? It's the 7th installment of the Body Piercing Jewelry Basics. Coming up next on Body Piercing Basics, episode number 150. Yeah, I've done 150 of these. For those that are new here at the Body Piercing and Tattooing channel, welcome to the channel. Hope you're enjoying the videos. Hope you're finding them helpful and useful and entertaining, but you might not know who I am. My name is DaVo. I'm a professional body piercer and have been since 1994. I own and operate the Axiom Body Piercing Studio, located right here in Des Moines, Iowa, inside Skin Kitchen Tattoo. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is oral piercings. Now, I'm going to define these as anything that's in the mouth or sticks out of the mouth or portion of the jewelry is inside the mouth in one way or another. We're going to talk about what gauge they're generally done at and what they're pierced at. Now, I'm also going to cover some that I do not do and in some cases do not advise. Well, mainly because if I don't mention them, I'm going to get asked in the comments. Before we get into that, here's some things you need to talk to your piercer about when choosing the gauge, because usually there's kind of an option between a few different sizes, and also something you should consider. With oral piercings, especially those that are lip or around the lip or mouth, and it's visible outside the mouth, generally the thicker the gauge, the bigger the hole, the more scarring it's going to create, and the more noticeable it's going to be. When given the option, it's usually best to go with a thinner gauge, because it's on your face, it's very noticeable, and it's not uncommon for lip piercings for decades after you remove the jewelry for them to be visible. So it may not mean much to you right now, but it might make a difference 10 years from now, depending on what your path in life is. So just keep in mind, thicker the gauge, larger the scar. The other thing you want to consider is whether or not you're thinking about stretching the piercing or putting larger, thicker jewelry in. Starting at a larger gauge kind of jumps the process and saves you a few steps during the healing or during the stretching. Understand that it usually does take longer to heal, and that initial the initial stretch, first one you do after it's healed, is probably going to take a little bit longer to get to. But understand, it's going to give you kind of a jump start. The next thing is, do you have any major medical things coming on or doctor's appointments or anything? Dental procedures, if it's anything that's going to involve being in the mouth, you're probably better off to not do the piercing until after those things are done. What gauge you do it at, if thicker gauge is probably going to stay open a little bit longer, or the availability, you might want to talk to your piercer about what they have available as far as retainers if you have to remove the jewelry, and what gauge those are usually stock. Okay, let's move on to the piercings I do. Starting with the beauty mark, also known as the Marilyn or the Madonna or the Crawford or whatever somebody decides to call it this week. They're done up here, upper lip, either side. 16 gauge is the most common. 14 gauge would be the second most common. 14 gauge usually isn't needed. Personally, I do 16 gauge. Now let's move on to the next one, the Medusa or Philtrum. The one that's there where Charlie Chaplin had a mustache. And then that other guy, we won't talk about him. Also done at 16 gauge or 14 gauge. Next up would be any Libre style or lip piercing done on the lower lip. All of these are done either at 16 gauge or 14 gauge. They can be done at 12 and larger if you do want to stretch, but those are the most common. Vertical Libre piercing, 16 gauge, most common. I have done them at 14 gauge in the past. This will do well with just about anything if the jewelry is the correct length. And this is done usually with a curved barbell. And something you throw under that same bus would be vertical lip piercings and I don't know, Jessups, is that what they're calling them now? The horizontal or the top lip done vertically. Either of those should probably be done at 16 gauge. That fang thing and everything else, those are done at 16 gauge. Now let's talk about tongue piercings. Usually midline is done at 14 gauge or larger. Tongue piercings stretch fairly easily, so it's not a problem to go to 12 gauge. Some people find the larger gauge is a little bit more comfortable. But the problem with it is that the larger the jewelry is, the thicker the jewelry is, the longer the jewelry's overall length will be, mainly because the balls start to increase in size. Where, yes, you may only have a 5/8 barbell in there, but each of the balls is 3/8 of an inch, which means you have basically a 5/8 plus 3/8. So, I mean, it basically, understand that if you do stretch piercings in your tongue, they're just going to keep getting longer. Venom piercings, which is the two tongue piercings side by side. These should be done at 14 gauge. Also, 12 gauge is possible. Now let's move on to the piercings that I don't do. Frownies and smileys. 16 gauge or 14 gauge. It really doesn't matter with these. The other one would be tongue webbing. Same difference. Usually done at 16 or 14 gauge. Cheek or dimple piercings. These I stopped really offering because I got tired of turning people away because they didn't have the correct anatomy for it. And maybe I was being a little too picky, but who knows? These should be done at 16 or 14. There's kind of a divided opinion on it. 14 is going to kind of reduce any migration or angle change on it. But for the most part, they're usually done at 16 gauge. Now let's move on to the high-risk piercings that I generally don't advise getting done. The first one would be the frog eye or scoop piercings. These tend to reject. I have had mixed opinions on this over the years, but it's horizontally done through the kind of it's a surface tongue piercing. And like all surface piercings, surface-to-surface piercings, it does reject, or it's commonly for them to reject. And you get the same look with venom piercings, and they're often confused. This one usually done at 14 gauge or 16 gauge, mainly 14 to try to get a little bit more resistance. I don't know if a service bar works any better there, and I really haven't heard much about people doing them with that. Now the next one, everybody's favorite internet sensation, the snake eye piercings. Usually done at 16 or 14 gauge. I don't really advise getting this piercing done. It might be better to do it at 16 because you're going to see less scarring when it rejects. But other than that, either 16 or 14. Dela piercings or black Dalo piercings or Joker piercings. These are usually done at 14 or 16, often at 14 just to kind of try to cut back on what they are known for, which is rejection and getting caught and tearing. Ashley piercing, 16 or 14 gauge. A lot of people would say there's no risk with this piercing at all, but the position in the back, especially in the contact it has with teeth, is why I put it on this list and why I don't do them. And I don't really like the way they look, but that's beside the point. Looks like somebody screwed up a Libre piercing. It's just me. Well, that's it. Did I miss anything? Do you have any experience with any of these piercings, and what gauge do they do yours at? Leave a comment. Until next time, here's hoping all your piercings heal with ease without a single issue. And if you're in the Des Moines, Iowa area, I hope to see you for your body piercing needs in the future. Have a good day, everybody. Take care, and we'll see you in the next video.